So today I'm going to be talking about the Covington book, Who's to Blame? Collective Guilt on Trial. So she did a trio of books and unfortunately passed away in 2023 when this book came out. And it's very much in the context of our current political moment, Trump's takeover of America, the rise of like populist fascism, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So in this book in particular, she's looking at a psychoanalytic lens of how to understand the aftermath of large scale atrocities and the widespread death, trauma, and victimization afterwards. And how do we understand blame and collective guilt or collective responsibility after these moments in history? And she goes through examples. And I think that's really important to understand now is as a group, how do we understand the concept of victims and perpetrators and group behavior and the morality of the political? So Covington, and I absolutely don't agree with everything she's saying wholesale, but she poses a lot of interesting questions, brings in a lot of familiar thinkers like Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi. And I like how much I felt challenged by this book, right? Because it was bringing up concepts that made me uncomfortable. On a large scale, the way we hold individuals accountable is just not the same for how we hold societies accountable, and that is very complex. So she was looking at societies in the aftermath of the Holocaust and other genocides, and the general moral pressure placed on perpetrators to exhibit guilt so that we can realign power and restore social morality, and how that's important. And there has to be a reckoning and justice and morality, finding our morality again, but that this idea of exhibiting guilt actually is false. And she thinks that it's not actually happening like we think, and that it's not actually helpful to try to make whole societies feel guilty, and that they aren't anyway. So in her first chapter, she's exploring this question of like, who's to blame? So again, it's human instinct to want to identify a culprit and understand who to blame in a chaotic and traumatic experience. In really conflict-laden relationships, where you just have like endless fighting between a couple, it can really be the same as endless conflict between nations. There's this focus on blame and righteousness, and people harboring resentment and denying their own aggression, and guilt being passed back and forth, and a desire, wanting your partner to accept blame actually is a mask for your own sadism and self-righteousness. And often societies will blame scapegoats as another point. So in genocides, minorities are blamed for social ills. They are shameful, they are primitive, they are a threat to the social order and group. And all the threats and evil, malign intent against the group is projected, or within the group is projected onto this other. So the group that is enacting the genocide define themselves as victims so that they can further attack and blame the other who holds all sin that is they are free of. So might remind you of current conflicts in the world right now. So when the scapegoat is eliminated, the group is cleansed. Differences are asserted, the group remains entitled and special and powerful. So then there are questions of blame, after widespread atrocities. Is that on the leader or the individuals, so the society as a whole? And it's interesting when you look at individuals who are involved in the perpetration of atrocities, they will often use denial and dissociation, and create dissonance between their internal morals, their humanity, right, of like, this is wrong, and external reality. Their authentic self can become detached from the self that is committing the crimes. And then we want to look at societal guilt. Hannah Arendt defines the difference between collective guilt and collective responsibility. So she believes we cannot hold the collective guilty. That guilt was really held with the individual for their actual individual transgressions, but that society can be responsible for what is done in society's name. So guilt lies with the individual. Collective responsibility means, on quote, I must be held responsible for something I have not done, and the reason for my responsibility must be my membership in a group, which no voluntary act of mine can solve. This kind of responsibility, in my opinion, is always political. So she's saying that we have vicarious responsibility for things we have not done, because that's the price we pay for living amongst others. That's the price we pay for having society, for being part of a human community, that we will inherently have a political responsibility, which is inherently forward-looking. So you live in society, if you live under a government within a community, you are then responsible collectively moving forward for what this group does, even if you didn't do actions yourself. But that does not mean you have to feel guilty for atrocities that occurred that you did not do individually. So that difference, Hannah Arendt posits as, a thing. Now, we may instinctually push back against that. I think it makes sense in a way. And I think they're also arguing, like, well, what's the use of feeling bad for things you didn't do, but you should feel responsible? And they kind of, Covington gets into this idea of endless cycles of blame, that blame is something that goes in cycles and is very much part of intransigent conflicts that we see in parts of the world. Grudges and blame become part of the group's identity, and they consolidate the group's identity, really on both sides as well, even victims and perpetrators. So demonizing the other and blaming them becomes part of the group's stability and holds people together. It actually promotes patriotism and unity. Transition. She gets into ideas further of collective guilt, that after atrocities happen, populations which we would expect to feel guilty do not actually experience real guilt as we understand it. And that she theorizes that many Germans and Confederates felt their lives were destroyed by those wars, and they saw themselves as victims. So, memorials and whatnot afterwards, right? There are memorials to cleanse themselves. They sort of disassociate and distance themselves from the atrocities that occurred. And, also there was this great sense of complete loss. And that's not because they realized, oh, we've committed all these atrocities. Like at the end of World War II, there were mass suicides in the thousands in Germany. And she argues this wasn't because of guilt, but really because of shame of defeat, the fear of reprisals from Soviets, propaganda from Nazi leadership, and an existential loss of identity. A loss of the system that gave you structure and meaning, and maybe a murderous rage towards their leader turned inward. Sure, Covington says we can have recognition and reconciliation and guilt and these acts of forgiveness from victims, but she argues that hatred lies dormant and repressed and will emerge again at some point when the group feels anxious about their identity or survival. So what about guilt versus shame? Covington has some very interesting ideas, and other thinkers that she brings in as well, about shame and its benefits and dangers. So guilt is when a specific action, should emerge when a specific action is taken by an individual that's a violation of their conscience, of morality. It's done within their control. So they have failed in terms of failing to act, or they've taken a bad action. And it's a betrayal of their inner code, and they've caused harm to others. So shame stems from something not within our control. It's a more amorphous feeling. It's when we have no self-agency, when we lose faith, when our sense of self has been denied and labeled as wrong. So the perpetrators deny the self in their commitment of atrocities, and victims lose dignity in being victimized. So shame arises from not being our ideal self. He gives the example of shame and the Garden of Eden. So this idea of eating the apple as an act of free will, but it reveals to us that humans are, so that eating the apple was the act of free will, like the actual action. But then shame arose from that because we realized that we have impulses and desires that are not always within our control. So the shame of losing face in front of God and humans becoming aware of our primitive, primal impulses, how we fear our being seen by society is linked to shame. And so that can be positive in terms of connecting us with others, that okay, we'll feel shame so we can understand that others are seeing us, that others have different identities. We can reflect on ourselves when we experience shame. But shame can also beget violence. So if we are unable to sit with shame, we need a powerful act of will to rid ourselves of such a deep and embodied feeling. So we need to reestablish our agency and reverse the roles so we identify with the aggressor. We feel like we've been perceived as less than, as weak, or we have been made weak, so therefore we want to be strong again. So there's a theory where you can understand shame as the cause of all violence, the rage against the impotence of the self. The weakness of using violence as an antidote to shame is that it creates shame in the perpetrator of the violence, who therefore has to be more violent to therefore get rid of more shame. So the torturer dehumanizes the victim, but then they have to dehumanize themselves in order to enact that torture. So their shame is split off and projected onto the other, and they must maintain perpetually this defense against reality. So shame requires, when you're trying to escape it, more violence and is self-perpetuating and becomes normalized, the violence, right? The victim becomes the scapegoat that holds the shame. Through shame, the group has power over the individual, right? Because the group offers protection and identity, a way to hide from shame. And the perpetrators, right, of these atrocities will sacrifice anything to prevent the disintegration of group identity. Girard. When unappeased, violence seeks and always finds a surrogate victim. The creature that excited its fury is abruptly replaced by another, chosen only because it is vulnerable and close at hand. So there's this original shame, right, that is never addressed and is repeated and enacted in violence through generations. But also shame can reveal, when we listen to our individual shame, what our internal morality really is and when we've strayed from it. So it addresses how we feel about events, about the self, how we relate to others, our moral position in relation to others. Covington gets into ideas of memory, identity, blame. So if we look at history, right, and stories, we can see that history often represents the interests of a group. Psychoanalysis on the individual level can be very helpful to craft a narrative, right? We're transforming memory into history with our analyst as a witness to remembered events. And we create a narrative where we have more self-agency. But history is often about controlling the group, or it can be, right? And it's written by the powerful. So when things go wrong, mistakes happen, leadership fails, the group identity is protected by placing blame on the other, maintaining the group's purity and rightness. And Professor Volkin, which Covington quotes, coined terms of chosen traumas and chosen glories that are written into historical narratives and become part of group identity. So the chosen trauma is a representation of a massive trauma that a group went through. And this trauma is then crafted into a specific narrative, right? That this is the horrific thing we went through. This is now part of our identity. It consolidates the group identity. It establishes the group's historical narrative. It is a trauma chosen above all traumas or perhaps the biggest trauma. Then there are chosen glories, which are the moments of triumph that celebrate the strength of the group and bolster its self-esteem, become part of its story. However, the dangers of both of these chosen traumas and chosen glories is that they can be absolutely manipulated by certain leaders, right? Under threat, the chosen trauma can be reactivated as a warning of danger and to instill aggression against the other. And that can absolutely become destructive when it's distorted and used for violent ends. And, what's interesting about how groups see themselves in history is that they always want to cast themselves in certain ways to avoid blame. So either as victims, heroes, repentant sinners, helpless bystanders, to save face. And, it's interesting how truth can be manipulated to accord with moral beliefs, also to avoid blame for harming others. This idea that there was no viable choice, or actually the perpetrators are the victims themselves. Or, we'll acknowledge harm and give reparations. All these things to save face. That monuments to atrocities that have occurred present a pure face to the public. And that there's often blame shifting in history. Groups try to deny atrocities or claim they were under attack, that they're the wounded innocent. And that actually it's really unfair when the world doesn't see that the perpetrators' actions were justified in the minds of that group, right? That they feel judged by others, that the moral outrage of the victims may actually provoke moral outrage in perpetrators. And the perpetrators feel like the world doesn't recognize their rightful position, and that they feel shame of losing face in front of the world. And that groups are really adept at shaping history to bolster their identity and their public face. And that groups naturally are resistant, like any group, right? Just the nature of groups. They're resistant to accepting blame, much less guilt, which isn't useful in Covington's mind. So Covington has a really bleak view of the emotional development of groups over time. And she gives an example of how we often are blind to atrocities happening in the present. On quote, "We still commit atrocities we abhor in others. We still scapegoat others for our social ills. We still exploit the less powerful. We still want to show the world we are blameless, or outright deny or claim atonement." And that the way individuals process trauma and all of the guilt is very different from how groups process these things. Covington believes that just inherently groups are defensive in nature and very resistant to understanding and accepting, right? Because when a group feels threatened, there's this deep fear of extinction. So they want to cleanse the threat, naturally, the group, and restore power. So this move to populism that we see, or fascism, is that the group fears their way of life, their very selves, their very survival, and they're seeking an omnipotent leader to rescue them, restore power, to be pure and omnipotent. That chosen histories can consolidate identity, but also create a rigid defense against acknowledging different interpretation of events. And the greater the threat to group identity, the more the group will revert to paranoid, schizoid ways of perceiving reality, and the more vulnerable they are to reenacting past traumas. But unfortunately, violent conflict serves an important role in group identity and group cohesion, that countries are inherently defined by their separateness from other countries, and therefore warfare to maintain that separateness. And that we see in history, groups often are brought together by conflict, and it helps promote unity and patriotism. And that when we are in moments of peace, actually peace contains the seeds for its own destruction, because there's not that sense of momentum to fight the other. Interject here is and I'll reference down below the videos of Cy Cantarell. Sorry, Cy. I love Cantorell's videos. They're great. In fact, I got some books that were recommended on Sai's channel, like Disaster Nationalism. I'm excited to read this. And I think that was maybe some aspects I wish I could have seen in Covington's argument about, well, like, personality and the individual still matters. It's not like in the group we all become sort of formless, samey blobs that just act in accordance with the group, right? I think that there's a large portion of the group that can go along with these sort of more destructive narratives because of their own individual tendencies. I do think groups can change, and I do think when groups don't, it's a reflection of certain personality traits that, in a particular video that Cy Cantorell discusses, when you have like people with more, let's like say it's like self-focused or narcissistic or resentful or fearful narratives in their lives, that like enough of these people gathered together can make for a group move to fascism. So I think that that's something that should be discussed. Covington's talking about her real skepticism about rituals of healing. So she's talking about memorials, truth commissions, reparations, and she's throwing in reparations like with not too much specificity. So, so she sees these as problematic because they're supposed to restore these like rituals after atrocities are supposed to restore peace between the perpetrators and victims. But she argues it's this like binary understanding of good and evil, right and wrong, victims and offenders. Just hold the phone. She is really speaking on a group level, not on an individual level of like those who actually like committed, atrocities. But when you go to the group level, how do you understand the group? And she believes these rituals are too binary, and that you're hoping to restore the victimized group, but really blame is being assigned in a way that is unhelpful, because you can't heal national trauma in the same way because individuals are different than groups. So these like rituals you're trying to do might work in sort of reconciliation between individuals, but not in huge groups. She thinks it just doesn't work. So there are pragmatic things that you have to do after atrocities occur, right? So the Nuremberg trials, they're trying to prosecute for the first time like large scale violence and try to find individual responsibility within the group, right? Because they're picking out individuals in those trials. So maybe, you're trying to find a pragmatic way to seek justice and move forward. But there, you run the risk of having individuals just stand in for the group. So when they're eliminated, the group is cleansed of blame. So she argues that it's complex because, let's say, the truth commissions in South America after the dictatorships, that the truth was necessary for helping individual families heal. And she argues that it was absolutely necessary, but that it doesn't establish social reform, or how to understand violence moving forward. So it's interesting. She says people who believe themselves to be victims of aggression have an understandable incapacity to believe they have committed atrocities. Myths of innocence and victimhood are a powerful obstacle in the way of confronting unwelcome facts. And then she gets into the ideas of forgiveness, memorialization. Derrida argues that pure forgiveness, for the Holocaust is simply impossible. And I would have to agree. So memorializing and artifacting, he argues, can strip memories of the horrors of their emotional context. So the dangers of memorializing. And I remember this quote from the History Boys movie. I never got to see the play. But he said something, one of the characters said something about we build memorials to forget, not to remember. So well-known sort of idea. And that forgiveness is personal, but it once becomes a collective imperative, it doesn't make sense. So the appeal of restorative justice is that what's lost or broken could be fixed, but that she argues that loss can never be remedied, and it doesn't address the heart of violence. Then there's this quote, which is interesting. I found myself really disagreeing in parts of this, and it was fascinating. So the vilification of the enemy is not only an attempt to regain collective morality, demarcating right and wrong, but also to purify the group from the threat of internal destructiveness by projecting this onto others. Such splitting is also a natural defense against trauma, but will result in repeated violence if it remains unintegrated. I had trouble parsing that. But I was like, what else though? You argue that this is, you have to have practical measures to like hold people, societies, groups accountable for atrocities. People have to process in some way. And what are we not supposed to acknowledge when whole populations have turned to evil? But at the same time, you're arguing that when we do try to acknowledge that, it's just like doesn't work. But in a way, she has points in that like it's not getting at the heart of what is driving and perpetuating these intransigent conflicts, and that there's going to be continued conflict. So she's unconvinced. She says perhaps repatriation is one idea she can get behind, which really, I mean, we're all thinking about Israel and Palestine, right, with all of this. So she would think maybe, and I can't speak for her, that repatriation could be a way of acknowledging, atrocities that have occurred and actually reintegrating people who have been displaced back into belonging. So, again, she says atrocities are completely incapacitating. They leave shock throughout the group at the ease of how social norms were broken, and we are left with a complete lack of trust in leaders in society, and that perhaps we want to seek revenge because it does restore a sense of self-agency. We want to move from humiliated, non-existent objects to honor, take action, act with power, honor the dead, to even cancel out the crimes. But this is impossible. These desires for revenge, which I guess she's equating with these rituals to heal and move forward, in her view only feeds more violence. And then she talks about the myth of closure. So the human reaction to violence is to try and cancel it out, to erase it, to forget it, or to acknowledge it, to compensate it, reconcile with it, but basically to try to make it better. So while reconciliation commissions, restorative justice and reparations attempt to produce a closure on violence and not repeat past traumas, it may help an individual, but she says it's not been proven effective on a political level to stop future violence. So then you get, I think she's arguing this question of like, well, what would do that? Is this the nature of groups? Is this human nature? Or are these like particular conflicts getting perpetuated and traumas getting perpetuated in certain groups just through generations? Atrocities create a trauma in which social norms are erased. Violence has no limits. The illusion of our safety is destroyed. Basic trust is destroyed. And it requires an acceptance of the destructiveness when we go through this in all of us. And she argues we cannot fully heal from this. And rather than rituals, she argues that what's more important to heal trauma is social order, authority, laws, a functional economy, and that recognition, acknowledgement, etc., within groups doesn't necessarily prevent future conflicts. But it is important to acknowledge, of course, what has happened, for justice to be sought, for societal moral codes to be reinstated. But it's the collective atonement memorializing that she thinks creates false unity. and perhaps prevents governments from seeing old conflicts reemerge. So, atonement does not protect against the return of the repressed, which is that repressed violence. And it's a false sense of closure. So, she believes the individual identity is much more open to change, right, and healing and betterment, while group identity is inherently defined by relations to the other, the enemy. So the group cannot risk giving up hatred because of a fear of or reality of being extinguished. So, in intransigent, generation spanning conflicts, years of animosity and violence have created and reinforced national identities that are centered on this conflict. So, I can't help but think of how much she's referencing, even if she doesn't mention it exactly. Although I do have a memory of her occasionally touching on Israel Palestine, but not too much, because it's tricky and to write that down. So, and this book was written several years ago. It's almost like she defined that conflict in this quote. It's so interesting to see, and I absolutely cannot do this justice here, but the idea of after the Holocaust, right, Israel was consolidated as a country for Jewish people who had just experienced a genocide and a deliberate attempt to erase their identity and a mass trauma. And their group identity within Israel, of course, is defined by a consolidation inwards, by this trauma they experienced. A whole country is inherently built or consolidated by this trauma and by defense against those who would destroy it. And yet, in the establishment of this country, it requires the displacement, genocide, annihilation of another people who are therefore defined by this trauma, right? This endlessly, constantly perpetuated trauma of displacement, of genocide, of apartheid, and that becomes the reality of that group, right? So this conflict is intransigent because it is endlessly self-perpetuating. The other group is perceived as the enemy, of course, and the source of annihilation, the source of complete and utter destruction. Even when the power imbalances make it so that it is much more likely and is true that one group is much more destructive of the other. She argues, back to Covington, that we can only heal if these sort of group conflicts and intransigent conflicts, maybe right through like law, economic stability, etc., and maybe shared vested interests. Maybe if there are those in these groups, right, who have shared vested interests, and even then past feuds can overwhelm those shared interests, even if it makes absolute logical sense, right, because those feuds are so powerful. So perhaps it's possible to make a peacekeeping truce so that future generations can find common cause. And this is most important: create and find new group identities. And I think that's essential. And in her final chapter, Covington gives a nice example of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. So there she gets into some nice, really interesting detail. And it gave me a lot of, just in the psychology of Putin and the arguments for why Russia justifies and Putin justifies the invasion of Ukraine. So she believes Putin utilizes Russian humiliation and victimhood, and then projects Russia's aggression onto Ukraine, or Putin and the government, and they plant false flags to then utilize later, so to validate their retaliation. So she thinks that there's a history of like blamelessness and thwarted self-agency in Russia that could be manipulated, and that it's a history of a national identity under threat. There's an archetype of a heroic martyr who sacrifices for the mother country. That there's this vision of a future that is as great as the past. And these certain chosen glories, right, that Putin is trying to say Russia can return to, like a certain lost imperial glory, a greater Russia, a cure for their generational humiliation. So, specifically, Putin also uses, and his government uses, disinformation, so that it's not that they're necessarily successfully indoctrinating the population with different lies, but that they flood the zone with disinformation so that the population no longer trusts information, that all information is suspect. So what can you do? It creates this idea that media cannot be trusted, that there is no such thing as objective reporting. So nothing is trustworthy. No one can make up their minds. The group is not able to think or judge or act. And then there's a great quote from Timothy Snyder about this, the Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, and then these larger ideas. The collapse of the politics of inevitability ushers in another experience of time, the politics of eternity. Whereas inevitability promises a better future for everyone, eternity places one nation at the center of a cyclical story of victimhood. Time is no longer a line into the future, but a circle that endlessly returns the same threats from the past. Within inevitability, no one is responsible because we all know that the details will sort themselves out for the better. Within eternity, no one is responsible because we all know that the enemy is coming no matter what we do. Eternity politicians spread the conviction that government cannot aid society as a whole, but it can only guard against threats. Progress gives way to doom. Covington goes on to discuss how Putin has resurrected the dream of Imperial Russia, this greater Eurasian Russia. So in this great Imperial Russia, right, Soviet Union 2.0, you can't separate out nations like Ukraine from the body of Russia. That's like chopping off a limb. So you're trying to restore the integrity and purity of greater Russia by invading Ukraine. And then she describes this, this word, it's tough. I am going to look up how to say that. Okay. Passionarnost. The ability to move forward and embrace change. Okay, so that's a concept she believes Putin utilizes. So it's a rationale for aggression that's like spiritual, that there's kind of this like manifest destiny to grow and expand, and that the Russian spirit and will of the masses must always move forward and embrace change. But at the same time, Russia is also always a perpetual victim. So will always struggle to defend herself from enemies, like in the Snyder quote, and, must continuously be striving for defense. A nation is always needed to defend itself for its existence. So it's a timeless, paranoid, schizoid position. The group is always innocent, the enemy is always external, and Russian aggression is projected onto the nations that are invaded.